Welcome everybody to the inaugural session of the briefing room. This is a new series that we've started to bring in different voices and younger voices. I'm Quentin Innes. I'll be your moderator tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Vas Patapovich. Vas graduated from RMC a year ago, 2024. He's now posted officially in Victoria, but he's working in Montreal for the summer and enjoying some good times there. In terms of procedures and processes, you can put your questions in the chat. I'll either read them out or defer to you, depending on whether you want to pose your own question yourself. We're going to run until 8 o'clock Mountain Time. Civil discourse, please keep it polite, keep it professional. And with that, I will hand over to Vas. Vas, off to you.
All right, so I've titled this presentation Russia's Holy War because it feels apt. The bizarre state of the Russian Orthodox Church came to RAUSI's attention due to the summary of an article titled "This is Pagan Paradigm, This is the Creation of an Idol" being posted on the social media app Threads. In the article, theologist Alexander Soldatov talks about the influence of historical revisionism on the Russian Orthodox Church, aka the ROC, and how its purposes aligned more closely with the concept of the Russian world than that of religion. Pointing to things such as the loose interpretation of religious scripture, the post-mortem reinterpretation of Stalin's actions, and schisms between the main doctrine espoused by Moscow and foreign branches of the ROC, which have, since their creation, existed in natural opposition to the ROC due to being started and led by those who fled Soviet oppression, Soldatov argues that Orthodoxy in Russia is now merely a husk of itself, a collection of symbols and traditions used as shorthand for conservative sentiments. The most vibrant example of this to an outsider looking in would be the appearance of Saint Stalin, seemingly numerous depictions of the bloody dictator in icons. The first public outcry around this happened in 2008, when an icon was unveiled in St. Petersburg depicting the pseudo-historical story of Stalin meeting Svятая Matrona Moskovska. Svятая Matrona was a blind fortune teller, whose biography claims that during the winter of 1941, Stalin met with her in order to ask about the fate of Moscow, and by extension, the entirety of the USSR. The primary reason this sparked controversy was that Svятая Matrona and her 1999 canonization as an Orthodox saint were considered divisive topics in the community. Her supposed meeting with Stalin is completely unsubstantiated, and her acts of healing and fortune-telling were seen by some as pagan perversions of faith rather than orthodoxy itself. The appearance of Stalin on the icon was secondary, not warranting great mention. The reimagining of Stalin as a warrior of the Lord, though not an official position held by the Russian Orthodox Church, was never a great leap for the Russian population to take. In order to understand this, one must first understand the impact of the Second World War, or more accurately, the Great Patriotic War, on post-Soviet self-identity. It is not controversial to say that the Soviet Union paid the blood price for the Allied victory during the Second World War. Every fourth Belarusian died over the course of this conflict. Both my great-grandfathers were enveloped in the war. One was a partisan, sabotaging Nazi railway lines, who later became an official part of the Red Army and, my family claims, fought all the way to Berlin. The other was a POW, who upon the end of the war was paid a generous stipend by the German government for the rest of his life. With an estimated 30 million dead, the conflict touched every single family in the USSR. The widespread devastation was impossible to ignore and created a great scar on the nation. In the years directly after the victory, the war was considered a horror never to be repeated again, though admittedly unifying to the Soviet identity. Every nation within this USSR paid and belonged to this victory. Stalin, it was argued, won the war no matter the cost. He liberated the people, and not just our people, but the entirety of Europe. My great-grandmother was a resident of one of the countless Belarusian villages that were burned to the ground. After being a scared child, watching, hidden in the woods, as Nazis round up everyone you've ever known, lock them in a barn and set fire to it, the idea of Stalin as a liberator becomes natural. I'm not pro-Stalin. He committed countless atrocities against his own people, not to mention the fact that perhaps there could have been less Soviet deaths if the system placed any value on human life. But I need you to imagine being a product of this conflict, of this nation, to understand the roots of Stalinism. The irrational, human, knee-jerk reaction to support the lesser of two evils in the bloodiest conflict the world has ever seen has been propped up by vehement denials of reality, like the refusal to acknowledge the aggressive and colonialist nature of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact for decades. Another example of the treatment of history in post-Soviet Russia would be the history textbook released in 2023 by Vladimir Medinsky, the current chairman of the Interdepartmental Commission on Historical Education of Russia and the former Minister of Culture. In History of Russia, 1945 to the beginning of the 21st century, it is stated that it is the fault of the United States that the USSR invaded both Afghanistan and Czechoslovakia. On the topic of Stalin, the book claims that the great leader felt horrified by the deaths caused by collectivization, confiding as much in Churchill during a meeting in 1942. The textbook is intended for 11th grade classrooms. Combine this blatant perversion of history with the framing of the Great Patriotic War as being a fight of good versus evil, with the Soviet Union playing the role of the good, the right, the holy, and suddenly it's no longer outrageous to suggest that the good Lord was working through Stalin. Supporters of this ideology may claim just that, not that Stalin himself is a saint, but that they are honoring the greater powers that were working through him. The issue with this is that if you look at some of the icons representing this, the Soviet leader always takes center stage. Take this icon being toted around by Stalinists. Though there is no halo around his head, it is he who is featured front and center. The framing of this conflict as the fight of ultimate good versus ultimate evil is intentional, since it is the myth that allows the Kremlin to maintain control. The elites cannot point to increased standards of living or economic prosperity as reasons for the population to stay complacent. They must create an atmosphere of constant foreign threat in order to maintain their grip. This eternal struggle is given legitimacy by its ties to the Great Patriotic War. It is an inherited battle passed on by our forebears, a solemn duty to stand up for goodness, godliness, against anyone who may threaten it. Dualism, specifically religious dualism, is a school of thought that hinges its understanding of the world on the idea that everything we see before us is a cosmic battle of good versus evil. This is the scene where the Russian world identity and religion combine. In the years since 1945, the war has gained nearly mythological status as exemplified by the change in the May 9th celebrations. Victory Day parades slowly morphed from solemn affairs focused on the enormous price that was paid for freedom to military showboating in an overly celebratory atmosphere, allowing rhetorics like "можем повторить," we can repeat it, to fester. The reason I've included effectively the same image many times over is to hammer home the fact that this is not a one-off sticker and not a fringe sentiment somewhere on the sidelines. This line of thought seems to be alive and well. Russian world is essentially the term used to claim that Slavic cultures are homogenous, more specifically that they are effectively all Russian. This manifests itself in numerous different ways, such as espousing the sacredness of Russian culture, glorifying the Soviet past, and viewing Ukraine, as well as most other former Soviet territories, as rightfully theirs. There's additional defining elements, such as feeling historically overshadowed by Europe and a general air of insecurity, but for the scope of this presentation, the most noteworthy thing is this insistence on their own self-importance being a pillar of the Putin regime. The Russian world is anchored in a fantastical version of the 1945 victory. The victory was unifying, wiping away any one nation's individual contributions for the sake of the greater Soviet victory. It solidified the USSR's position as a great power and excused the influence it exerted over nearby territories. After all, was an anti-capitalist zone deserved for vanquishing an enemy so cataclysmic? Shouldn't those nations be eternally grateful to their liberators? Add to this entitlement the religious dualism element, and suddenly it is Russia's sworn duty to stand against all evil, all sin, for who else could be the defenders of purity if not the nation of victors? For the past few months, I've been diligently rotting my brain by frequently tuning into the Russian news, specifically Channel 1's Vremya for anyone interested. A noteworthy shift has taken place since the time I first became interested in this topic. You see, since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine and for years leading up to it, the Russian world's idea of a patriot was someone of devout Orthodox faith. The most ridiculous extent this reached was reframing Soviet soldiers, such as Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, as overtly religious. Kosmodemyanskaya was an 18-year-old Soviet soldier who was captured, tortured, and executed by the German invaders in late 1941. Hers is a tale of heroism and defiance since she refused to give up any information and until the very end held on to her beliefs, using her last words to empower the occupied onlookers who gathered to watch her execution. A 2020 film that was sponsored by the RF's Ministry of Culture removed Zoya from her highly ideological roots, turning her into a Christ-like figure dying for our sins. Famous astronaut Yuri Gagarin was not spared this treatment either and can now be seen as part of this icon, along with other pioneers of the Soviet space program. Since the Soviet Union was officially devoid of religion, religion has been inserted into history posthumously in order to neatly tie in the dualist worldview of the Russian world. This year's Victory Day celebrations showcased an interesting shift away from orthodoxy and towards a more generalized idea of faith. In the many hours long televised preamble to the main parade in Moscow, Channel 1 had a segment on faith. But it was not just the ROC that was featured, but Muslims, Buddhists, and Jews also had a chance to speak about how this holiday affects their faith. As put by the announcer introducing this segment, Victory Day is for all of us who are alive today a holy day. The faith may be different, but the victory is shared among us all. This ties in nicely with Soldatov's thoughts on the hollow state of orthodoxy as it is espoused by those in charge. It is merely a convenient collection of symbols, not a genuinely developed theology. Make no mistake, abject insanity still reigns on specifically Orthodox channels, with programs such as A Prayer for Victory, discussing the supposed religious backbone which allowed the USSR to survive the Second World War. Another topic beloved by pseudo-theologists which frequent the Russian airwaves is the war in Ukraine. War in the Bible is a 16-episode documentary which debuted on the Orthodox TV channel Spas on the 21st of November 2022. It is based upon a book of the same name written by Nikolai Serbsky, a bishop in the Serbian Orthodox Church, which in 1932 spoke of a great oncoming conflict. The show uses the framework of this book as a vehicle to discuss and explain the war in Ukraine. From the now familiar dualist formulation of framing this as a conflict of one of good versus evil, to explicitly calling NATO forces an alliance between man and the devil, it is truly a fascinating piece of media. This is the most concentrated form of the pseudo-religious rhetoric that has surrounded the war in Ukraine. The dialogue around the invasion ranges from the aforementioned extreme approach of saying they are literally colluding with the forces of evil, to framing the conflict as a continuation of the Great Patriotic War, to the subtle religious language used when discussing the special operation. Without understanding the context of the Great Patriotic War, it is nearly impossible to explain Russia's insistence on referring to their invasion of Ukraine as a fight against Nazism. There was, in fact, a significant amount of collaborationism amongst the Ukrainian population, but the reasons for this are more complicated than the blanket statement of Ukraine had a lot of bigots and Nazis in it. It would be more honest to say that Ukraine and Moscow always had a complicated relationship, which led to some Ukrainians siding with the invading Nazi force in order to, from their perspective, counter Soviet oppression. The RF is weaponizing this fact to promote their aggressive takeover of Ukraine as a liberational effort. It is a continuation of Russia's eternal battle against evil, as is personified by Nazism. In this year's Victory Day speech, Vladimir Putin referred to Russia as the nation of victors, stating that our ancestors left us a duty to protect our homeland, to be united, to defend our national interests, our thousand-year-long history, culture, traditional values, everything that is important and sacred to us. The formulation of sacred is worth noting here, since these are the terms in which the Russian world and its interests have been described in for years. Russia views itself as a defender of purity, much in the same way that America views itself as a defender of freedom. This existential conflict may have started with the invasion of Ukraine, but it will not end there. As put by Maria Domska in her paper, The Myth of the Great Patriotic War as a Tool of Kremlin's Great Power Policy, as regards foreign policy, there's a long-term interest of strategic nature. They include Western consent to Russian hegemony over the post-Soviet area, revisions of the European security architecture in line with Moscow's interests, limitations of the US's presence and influence in Europe, and finally, unrestricted and unconditional opportunities for economic and political cooperation with the West. A War Made in Russia is a 2023 book discussing the inevitability of the invasion of Ukraine. Of course, this is much easier to see in hindsight, but the regime has spent years desensitizing its people to violence, war, and sacrifice. When this is combined with the bloodthirst the RF inherited from the Soviet Union, it is clear to see that Russia's intent was never to remain passive in the world theater. In the book, Sergei Medvedev has a section titled War as Identity. In it, he states, this war marked a radical break for Russia from the previous 30 years of post-Soviet period, from global markets to international institutions. It brought Russia under unprecedented sanctions and made it a global pariah, yet surprisingly, it did not lead to social or internal political destabilization. Most of the population took it as something that was meant to happen, clothing themselves in it as if it were their grandfather's old military overcoat. The propaganda mill worked well. As usual, the world was divided into us and them. The vast majority of the population developed complex psychological defense in order to justify, accept, or ignore the war. creating a zone of comfort, a kind of shell in which they can live as they always did. The war has been normalized and absorbed into everyday life, into daily news bulletins, and the people regard it as a state of necessity, which is above any criticism in Russia because the leadership at the top knows best. What we are looking at is a new Pax Romana, the maintaining of internal stability through a sense of external conflict. Stalin and his supporters are not the real threat here. They are a minority, grasping onto a sense of security provided by an idea of a world that no longer exists and may have never existed at all. A world where protector where a world where Protector Stalin valiantly vanquished the Nazi Hydra. He is a symptom of a hollow ideology, masquerading as orthodoxy and acting as a mascot for the Russian world. He is a symptom of a nation that is so dependent on external conflict in order to maintain any semblance of internal stability that we have found ourselves in a second Cold War.
Vas, thank you very much for that. That's a great overview of where we are and how we got there. I've got a couple of notes that I made as we were going through here.
Sure thing.
So starting with Soviet identity. Um, so there was a bit of in the 1920s, there was this idea of the Soviet man that was going to replace the old Western idea of a person. And probably some of this came out of the idea of breaking the bonds of serfhood. I mean, the serfs were really only freed in Russia in the 1870s, so you've got maybe two generations until the First World War. And then this idea of remaking Russian identity as a Soviet identity and remaking the basis of that identity being Marxist-Leninist thought and communist, loyalty to the communist state, communist ideology. Do you now see a shift in Soviet identity? And do you think they're reaching back to that pre-First World War identity, that pre-revolutionary identity?
To some extent, I believe that they are, but it is more like that identity existed in a very different time and place than we exist in now, obviously. So it's a lot less applicable. And so it's more like having a zombified version of that identity, being populated as kind of the ideal way to be. So I would say that they are hearkening back to those kind of symbols and kind of the esprit of that old Soviet man, if you were to phrase it that way. But I do not believe that it is identical, since, speaking bluntly, that world no longer exists. And so it's just, it wouldn't be apt to have it be exactly the same thing again.
Okay. There was a very revealing conversation that Putin had with Oliver Stone. Stone did a series of documentaries with Putin, and part of it is Putin, sort of driving around in his Mercedes, Stone beside him, and they're just chit-chatting. Putin apparently likes to drive himself, or did. And at one point, he talks about how in previous times, when he was growing up as a kid in Russia or in the Soviet Union, there was that Soviet identity that they could rely on. And now he says the kind of exact, well, I'm paraphrasing here because it was a translation, but basically what he said was people need something to believe in. In the old days, they believed in communism, and now we have to replace that belief with something new. So do you see this as a deliberate play by Putin and his cronies to reintroduce religion back into Russia?
I think there was a push for that, but as I kind of alluded to in my presentation, I do not think that the push was as effective as they had hoped, and I don't think that people are grabbing onto the Orthodox ideology as much as they would have liked. Um, and I think the whole idea of like the Soviet man and stuff like that, to add on to what I was saying before, that is more like a zombified version of that. I think that also that idea has been influenced heavily by the 90s and sort of the events that took place after the collapse of the Soviet Union in Russia, since there is still, I would argue, like a great cult of identity, I think it is called, like when in dictatorships everything is about the leader and there's a big focus on the leader, except there's almost During the Soviet Union, there was an emphasis on the benevolence of the leader and kind of the knowledge and how powerful and respected and how much of a great leader they were. Whereas now I feel like because of the almost like bandit culture of the 90s, that was where Putin gained power in the KGB and all that. I think because of that, there's almost a culture of like, yeah, maybe our leader's a dictator, but isn't he so cool about it? Like I distinctly remember that from the early 2000s. Like I think we all remember there was a point where there was like all those pictures of Putin like riding horses shirtless and stuff like that. And there was a big like push in terms of like cult of personality, but almost not in like a benevolent kind of like grandfather Stalin sort of way, but more in kind of like, look at my cool older brother over there riding horses, almost sort of way. So I think the 90s influenced Russian culture in a greater way than we have yet grasped, just because of how much it was a collapse of ideals.
Yeah, I don't think you can go through what Russian society went through in the 90s, with people literally dying in the streets, and not have that affect you in some way. It's way, way worse than what the Germans went through in the 1920s before the Weimar Republic kind of stabilized things. Yeah, okay. So and you brought up a really great point there, which is a shift in the kind of relationship between the Tsar and his subjects, the Tsar being the benevolent father figure, and Putin and his subjects, Putin being almost like a gang boss.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'm going to shift to the audience now. Joe Howard's got a question here. So Joe, if you'd like to unmute yourself and carry on.
Thanks, Quentin. And Vas, thanks very much for the presentation. I'm coming at this from the perspective of international law, which is where I hang out, if I hang out anywhere. And I'm looking at the evolution of law, starting with the just war, which was a pre-Westphalian phenomenon. But it said that there are ethical conditions that make war permissible. Then if we move to 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, and if we look to 1627, when Hugo Grotius first penned his treatise on international law, and he says, we're going to base international law on natural law, which is there are some sort of universal moral principles. It's perhaps an evolution from the just war. And that progresses into what we have now, positive international law, which is law made by humans. And I guess the question is, can you see where the Russian Holy War fits into that chronology of law? And your answer to that question should be guided by how Russia interprets international law. We in the West here are familiar with the rule of law. China has got an instrumentalist approach where law is a tool of policy. But in Russia, international law is whatever it takes to protect Mother Russia.
Right.
Talk about Max Flex. So with that in mind, can you see where your hypothesis about the Russian Holy War fits into the chronology? Is this just a just war in terms of 2025, or is it a reversion to natural law, or is there something beyond morality and beyond ethics? Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in. I am not a political scientist. I am a historian, so I'm a little bit out of my depth when it comes to things like just law and the Treaty of Westphalia and whatnot, but I will answer this to the best of my abilities. I think for them, it certainly harkens back to a sort of moralist approach to war, where people used to go to war about religion a lot more. And I think it is the easiest thing to justify something as vague as a holy war, because holiness can be defined as anything. Like define traditional values, you know what I mean? Because the traditional values will be always anchored in the society that they are spawned from. They will always be like traditional values might be different for in Canada right now versus what they look like in China. The definitions will be varied. And so I think picking something as arbitrary as a holy war, as a reason to incite conflict, is again just a reason to kind of stay in a perpetual state of conflict because you can always keep moving that bar. I hope that answers your question, at least in part. Thank you.
Joe, does that work? Okay. Having heard from Joe, I think we'll go to David Jackson next. He's posted a question in the chat, which really seems to tie into the idea of how the Russians are evolving religion almost in parallel with the way the Americans are doing it. David, if I'm reading your question correctly, but rather than put words in your mouth, I will pass the floor to you.
Go ahead. I got going down the rabbit hole of watching stuff on Russia Today and took note of the Patriot Park and the big cathedral that the Russian defense minister built to the Russian armed forces
Right. Yeah.
out there. And I I don't know if it's propaganda or not, but is it true that historically the Russians built churches to commemorate victories in war around the country? And then the second part, I noted how much in that church they made Stalin out to be like a saint, some kind, and if that's true for any other former Soviet Russian leaders in any other churches.
Thank you for your question. Is it true that we used to build cathedrals? From my understanding, not necessarily to commemorate great battles, but cathedrals would be built as kind of a thank you to the community, because again, they were serfs for a long time, and so kind of the only thing they had was religion. The only like aspect of social life was religion, and so that was
Mhm.
a way of ingratiating yourself to the population. So I could see that being used as like after participating in a conflict, but I can't confirm necessarily that like, oh yeah, after this great battle this cathedral was built or anything like that. I'm honestly not sure. But yeah, that cathedral is truly insane. It is gorgeous. It is absolutely beautiful. Like I'd
Mhm.
love to
Mhm.
go. But
Mhm.
just for in terms of what it represents and how much again, how much it ties in the Great Patriotic War with almost this like holy war aspect of it, where like Nazism is defined not just as an enemy that was faced, but as like a cosmic evil that was defeated.
Mhm.
The treatment of Stalin, I have seen it argued that like Stalin should be allowed to be portrayed on icons because portraying negative characters on icons doesn't necessarily mean that you are endorsing their actions, that there are other sort of characters in the Christian canon that might be portrayed in icons or beside holy iconography, but not necessarily in a way that they're um saying that what they did was right or just, but just kind of like having it there. But honestly, I think for Russia that because I've seen the argument made and specifically in Georgian discourse that has come up around this because Stalin was Georgian, and so there's a lot of kind of turmoil and grief about what to do to reconcile with that. But I feel like in Russia there isn't really a conversation being had about the impact of Stalin, which I think, again, just because of how badly history is diluted, I don't think that conversation is really being had on any massive platform about the fact that maybe we shouldn't endorse Stalin, because I think all of it gets wiped away with, like, oh, so you're saying we should have lost the Second World War? And it's like, well, no, I don't think we have to choose one or the other necessarily. I don't think we have to choose between 30 million dead and lose, like, and, becoming Lebensraum. Like, I don't.
Second question there. I watched a Netflix documentary entitled The Family, and it was about Dugco and these prayer breakfasts that are held in Washington, D.C. And the documentary only scraped the surface about the support of this organization and group that puts on these prayer breakfasts for the return to the faith that is happening over in Russia. And I was wondering if any of your research has gone down that rabbit hole yet.
It has not. I have not heard this documentary. I have not seen it. I will note it down. It sounds very interesting, but no, I
Mhm.
can't really comment on a documentary I haven't
Okay.
seen.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good stuff. So, David, does that answer your questions?
Very good. Thank you.
Very good. Awesome. Yeah, Joe, go ahead. You have a follow-on question?
I have another question, not a follow-up.
Sure thing.
Thanks. Um, could you see this phenomenon of a holy war occurring in any either the way you've described it or in a variant in another political system? Could you see it happening in a Western liberal democracy, or where there may be sort of a Christian evangelical movement? Or could you see it definitely not happening in a China, where there is an absence of a religion to varying degrees? You know, again, to rephrase the question, to what degree does how much does there have to be a religious thread in order for there to be a holy war? About, do you see where I'm coming from on this? You got any thoughts? Putting you
I
on the
think
spot?
no, all good. I think there does need to be a historic religious through line sort of thing. And China is not my wheelhouse, but from what I understand, they have been quite removed from religion for a very long time. And though the Soviet Union was officially removed from religion for that, 80-ish year period that it existed, the religion didn't really go away, just kind of went underground. So I don't think that it's successfully destroyed the religious through line that existed there. And to your first question as to if I could see holy war sort of rhetoric happening somewhere else, I think it is pretty clear we're starting to dance around the descent towards.
Okay, it looks like Vas is frozen.
My follow-on question to
Yep.
Vaz while we're waiting will be, does Japan show it's in Asia, but does he have a different answer for Japan, vice China?
Yep.
Anyway,
So when
we
Vas comes back up, then we'll go to Sarah first.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
Joe,
by all
I'll
means.
cut back to
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, no worries.
I think it's interesting because unless you really study the history or know it, it seems sort of obtuse and very different from our own, the Russian culture and the Russian nationalism. And it's something that's opaque, I think, to most Westerners.
Well, going back to David's question about the cathedrals, I don't know what the exact history of the cathedrals is. It's probably worth digging into. But what I can tell you is that when I was in Latvia, the main Russian Orthodox cathedral sits at the top of what is now Brivibas Street, which used to be Tsar Alexander Street before 1919. So it's the main street of Riga. And that Russian Orthodox cathedral sits right there. And then when you go to Estonia, if you go into Tallinn, the cathedral, the Russian Orthodox cathedral, sits on the highest point of the city. So it can be seen from anywhere in the city, including the harbor. So I think there was a very deliberate kind of, imposition of that kind of structure on the territories that the Russians conquered or occupied or gained through treaty or war. And I think that the Orthodox Church has been closely tied in with the Russian political system for a long, long time. I think really what's happening now is they're just going back to status quo.
If I could step in here for a moment.
Yep.
I don't think it's going back to the status quo. I'm not sure whether it was Stalin or Lenin who said that religion was the opiate of the people. And in the 1920s onwards, they stamped out any sort of religious observances at all. They cleared out the churches. They drove whoever was still practicing some sort of religion underground completely, because that was against communism. And that fell apart in 1989 when the Soviet Union ended. And now there is a resurgence of some sort of religion, and it's more like a cheerleading squad that Putin has installed to make him as the wonderful leader that he is. He's not really, he doesn't give a damn about anybody except himself, but religion has gone full circle from being totally oppressed and the enemy of the state to now being a tool of the state. And I don't think that it is something that we really understand because we don't have it happening here.
Well, not
That's
yet.
my 2 bits.
I'm back. Sorry about that. My router decided to reboot mid-sentence. For a second, I was like, the Americans are listening. 'Cause as soon as I brought up the US, my internet died completely. But no, it's just technical difficulties. My bad.
Okay, Vas, do you want to complete that thought that you had, and then we'll pass to Sarah?
I was just saying that it seems to be that we are dancing around the kind of shift towards religion and towards authoritarianism and right-wing ideology that is happening down south. And I don't think that a holy war sort of rhetoric is possible in a liberal democracy, but a liberal democracy is not guaranteed to always be the status quo.
Absolutely. Okay, Sarah, I'm going to pass to you because that kind of leads into your question about Patriarch Kirill.
Yeah, and we were just chatting, and I think Philip Fisher was talking about how, the church is sort of a tool of the state. And I was just curious more about that, and specifically the role of Patriarch Kirill and just how the church may operate as a tool of the state, in your opinion.
I think there has been a shift away from Patriarch Kirill. I don't know if it is a personal schism that is happening between Putin and him, if it's like a conflict of personality, like a Trump-Musk sort of situation happening, or if it's just kind of because the ideology seems to be less effective than what they had hoped for. Because at a certain point, there was a like it was kind of ridiculous the extent to which religion was being pushed onto the populace in terms of blessing missiles, in terms of Patriarch Kirill seemed to have something to say on every issue known to man, in terms of always seeming to have like the airwaves and stuff like that. And there has been a shift away from it in the past couple of years. Like the last time that Patriarch Kirill made an address of any sort or like acknowledged officially the Victory Day, like May 9th, was in 2023. That was the last address that he did for Victory Day. He didn't do one last year and he did not do one this year. He was actually, I would say, notably absent from the kind of parade processions this year. So I think, yeah, religion has, I think there's a shift away from Orthodoxy and therefore a shift away from the Patriarch.
Sarah, does that answer the question?
Yeah. So then sort of the influences you're talking about are more almost folk religion influences, like versus sort of the hard power of the church, or
It seems to be that they're less relying on specifically going to church and espousing orthodoxy and kind of following like orthodox principle and more just kind of like vague idea of faith in the same way that like I would say a lot of people in the West are vaguely Christian in that sort of way where it's like, yeah, you were baptized, yeah, you sort of kind of follow like most of the holidays, but it's not like you're going to church all the time, it's not like you're paying tithes, it's not like you're doing that sort of thing. So I think they're appealing more to that general populist sort of sense of like a vague religion kind of like air, or vague religious air versus the actual like hard line going to church sort of Orthodox Christians.
Yeah, it's what I call cappuccino Christianity, right?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Like that one. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I keep trying to explain this to people when we talk about cultures like Afghanistan, where people are truly religious.
Right.
And a truly religious argument makes sense to people like that. But to be honest, for most of us in the West, we no longer live in Christendom. We no longer pray 5 times a day. We don't fast at Lent. And we've lost a lot of the kind of trappings of religion that we used to have. And I would argue arguably we're in a post-Christian society. So is it possible that Russia, based on what you've just said, is Russia moving to a post-Orthodox society?
I would say post-Orthodox would be a little bit hasty because again, we are right off the heels of priests blessing missiles or people purchasing those. I don't know if you've seen them. It made rounds on the internet a little while ago, but in some video game, I can't remember what video game it is. I want to say like not War Thunder, but there's some video game where there's a video game item that you can gain where it's like a little token of faith that you can put as like a stat booster on yourself. And the video game is apparently very popular in Russia. And so someone on like WWII, which is like Russian Facebook, basically was selling these things. Except the funny thing is that there were priests actually blessing them, so it's not like it was just a thing that was happening on a corner of the internet. It's that there was like actual religious involvement with it too. So it seems like, I guess, there was a market for people like genuinely on the front lines purchasing these kind of icons to carry on them in hopes of gaining some kind of religious protection from it. So I think it is far too soon to say that we are moving into like a post-Orthodox space for Russia. I'm just positing that we are moving away from like strict orthodoxy the way they were trying to promote it.
Yeah, Putin made a comment a number of years ago to the effect of in Russia lives Russians. And
Yeah.
he was kind of, poo-pooing the idea of a multicultural society. And he said, if you're a Russian Muslim is still a Russian. A Russian Buddhist is still a Russian.
Yeah.
So it was interesting when you threw up that slide of the 3 different religions. So 4 different religions, because you got a Jewish and a Jewish person praying as well. So it seems like the Orthodoxy is expanding to include all other religions. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say like what you said at the beginning is, I think, very like pertinent in that like it seems that being Russian trumps anything, and being Russian is very vague. Like I'm sure Putin would define me as a Russian, even though I have lived outside the country for many, many years and I'm a citizen of Belarus, if anything. So yeah, I think it's just the idea of that the Russian world kind of hinges itself on the idea that all of Slavic culture is almost a hegemony. Is that how you conjugate that word? Is homogenous and could be just kind of swept under the Russian rug sort of thing, that it's like, oh, it's easy for you to kind of get absorbed to this culture because it's the superior culture anyway, almost sort of rhetoric where it's like, oh, look at us, we have ballet and Tchaikovsky and all this other stuff that they always point to as like almost cornerstones of culture. And I think this stems from like a deep insecurity that for years it's almost like Russia has always felt too European for Asia, but too Asian for Europeans. So it leaves them in kind of a strange cultural position where they've been comparing themselves to Europe and kind of trying to have ties with Europe for hundreds of years, but seem to feel themselves inferior to other Europeans, or Europeans, it depends on how you want to frame it. And I think just the Russian world is just kind of like a very sharp example of that, of being like, no guys, I swear we have the superior culture. Like, trust me, our culture is so good. Everyone wants it. Everyone is part of it, actually. And obviously this also is super helpful when it comes to like absorbing states. It's very easy to absorb a state if you just decide that they are also you.
Yeah. And it's interesting when you go to the Baltics, the population of Latvia is about 23% Russian. And they don't consider themselves Latvians, they consider themselves Russians. And the idea that wherever there are Russians, there is Russia.
Yeah.
So if there's one Russian in Warsaw, then that means that Warsaw is part of Russia. It's an interesting kind of extension of, and it very much the same way Hitler played it when he talked about all the little lost German colonies all through Eastern Europe as being part of Germany, right?
Yeah.
Those are Germans. The Volga Germans are Germans. They've been there for 500 years.
That's the exact same rhetoric that was used in the invasion of Ukraine, like with the Donbass region and stuff like that, where it's like, we gotta rescue the Russians that are there, whether they want to be rescued or whether they consider themselves Russian or not. We are invading a sovereign country in order to, again, yeah, save our little colonies, save the oppressed Russian population.
And it's an extension of the R2P doctrine, right? When people were espousing the responsibility to protect doctrine back in the 1990s, and they were using it as the reason for going into Kosovo, I'm kind of shaking my head thinking this is going to backfire on you guys, because if we can do it, so can other people.
Yeah.
So I just want to shift. Ian Gillian said he's got no microphone, but he's got a question here. Given the Holy War concept, in what ways are we in the West playing into this narrative? And he goes on to say, I noticed a significant amount of Russian media talked extensively about Canadian difficulties with reconciliation, an obviously ironic take from Russia on how to treat native populations. So this idea of, I think what we're getting at here is Slavic culture being homogenous. How much are we playing into that narrative that the Russians are giving out?
How much are we playing into the narrative?
I can give you a specific example. When
Please.
the Brits rolled into Estonia, one of their information operations threads or Stratcom threads, whatever we're calling it this week, was reconnecting with the Russian minority population in Estonia. They were very concerned that the Russians in Estonia didn't identify as Estonian, that they in fact identified as Russian. And I think it's the town of Narva, I think, is right up on the Russian Estonia border. And that town is majority Russian. It's been populated by Russians, and it's geographically contiguous with Russia. So in a way, it's almost like a Spanish-speaking population in the United States, which is geographically contiguous with Mexico. So at what point does Western kind of narratives play into the Russian narrative of reclaiming their populations?
I'm honestly not sure how to answer that question, so I will circle back to it because I do have something to say about the talking about Canadian reconciliation and stuff like that. Because I think the difference is that Russia fundamentally does not see itself as a colonialist power. It does not see anything that it has done as colonization. Um Fundamentally, like, it doesn't, there are absolutely native populations in Russia, which I'm sure that if you ask them would see themselves as distinct from the Russian world hegemony, but they're not viewed that way by the narrative because, again, Russia just fundamentally, it always, like, Russia has a tendency to point towards kind of Western failures in colonizing and colonization and stuff like that. In what I mean by that is pointing towards, like, for example, Britain colonizing the Americas and stuff like that, and being like, well, we never did that, so we are better, sort of thing. Even though just because the colonization happened, like, horizontally instead of overseas doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but they fundamentally, their narrative does not allow for them to be colonizers because that would involve acknowledging way too much other things, way too much other stuff.
And, and frankly, we do play into that narrative because nobody brings that up.
Yeah.
Nobody talks about Eastern Europe being a post-colonial problem. No one
Yeah.
uses the language of colonization to describe what Russians are doing. So I'm glad that you brought that point up. Okay, Oliver has a question about the soldiers in the Russian Federation, so I'll pass the floor to him.
Yeah, I have a quick question. So we've talked a lot about, well, soldiers of Soviet, World War II, they've been sort of deified, sanctified, by the Russian Orthodox Church. Do you see something similar being done with the current soldiers who've been killed in the current war in Ukraine?
I do not see that being done with specific soldiers on the Ukrainian side. There is still a sort of Orthodox lean to it in that I'm sure you've seen, like, pictures of, like, Saint Javelin sort of thing where it's like having Ukrainian saints pointing weapons, and again viewing this, having religious symbol as kind of like a unifying thing for the Ukrainian forces. But no, I'm not seeing the sanctifying of specific fallen soldiers in the Ukraine war. Because again, I think they see it a lot more as like almost a like war of decolonization versus a like a war of conquest or a holy war or a almost crusade like effort.
I mean, more like on the Russian side. Do the Russians deify like their dead, or is it just something that's just left to World War II soldiers?
I would say they do deify their dead to some extent, and I would say that again, it's not like specific soldiers, but there is definitely a narrative of like they died fighting the good cause and like for the right narrative, if that makes sense. There is a certain degree of that, but not to the degree of the Second World War. Honestly, if I was to say why that was happening was because individual Russian families are still alive and might have things to say about their dead being used in this way, whereas this Great Patriotic War is almost viewed as completely untouchable in the discourse, and there's a lot of kind of yeah, just sanctifying and whole like deifying your own relatives that were in the Second World War. As is seen in a lot of I'm forgetting the exact name of it eludes me right now, but in a lot of Victory Day celebrations, there is a portion where people bring out portraits of their own like loved
I
ones and
think it's
family
called
members.
Immortal Regiment.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah, in the Immortal Regiment, they bring out pictures of their own like deceased loved ones, stuff like that, and everyone. And because the war again touched every single family, everyone's got one. So it's like, oh, here's my great grandfather, who I'm so proud of for again vanquishing the Nazi Hydra. Um, but like because there has been distance with that, I think it's a lot easier to kind of not examine that any further. Like for example, when I was told growing up that my grandfather had fought in Berlin, I was just kind of like, "Oh, great. Cool. Fuck Nazis, right?" Um and now kind of actually being a student of history and being like, "Oh, the Soviets did a lot of bad things in when they were in Berlin." Like that it's a lot more complicated, but that it's not willing to be examined as that, and I feel like like if you take Russian soldiers that have died on the front recently and their individual families which might have their own interpretation of the war, because again there are some people that were conscripted into this conflict where they might not agree with the sanctifying of a war they didn't necessarily sign up for or believe in. I just think it would be a lot more difficult to sanctify people that are individual people that still have living family members to talk about them. I hope that was coherent. I think I was all over the place with that
Yeah,
one,
it
but
solved my question. I just wanted to see if there was parallels between like the Immortal Regiment thing they do for the World War II soldiers and the current conflict, if you will.
not in that way, not in that people are toting around pictures of their dead family members as they do with the Immortal Regiment, but just kind of in the vague sort of religious way that I think a lot of wars are fought, where it's like there's a religious subtext to a lot of wars. Um, just like again, not in like an abnormal way, like with because I would call the Immortal Regiment almost like an abnormal phenomenon.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's all my question.
Hey guys, we're almost at the top of the hour. Are there any final questions?
Yeah, I have a
Joe?
question. What is the advantage, the tactical advantage that the Holy War gives to the state? You've done a very good job of presenting the situation. What's the upside to this in terms of Russia's advancing its vital national interests? How is this going to be justified at a cabinet meeting where we say, well, we've characterized this as a holy war, and you've done a very eloquent job of that. So what do we get out of that? What's the advantage?
The advantage
And
is
your answer will tell me, gee, can we replicate that same phenomenon in a Western liberal democracy or in an instrumentalist state like China?
mm, I think the advantage of that is that it fuels a sense of always being on the defensive. And I think that is what is keeping their foreign policy alive and fueled. It is less the idea. There is definitely, again, okay, as I said, there is definitely the idea of needing to be the protectors of purity, sort of thing. But the inverse of this is that purity is under attack. Purity needs to be defended, right? That is the implication of the statement of defenders of purity, is that our values, our way of life, our whatever is under attack. And so I think that is the main advantage of it, is that you can frame so many things as an attack on your own liberties if you frame it through that lens.
I get it, but how is says Vladimir, how is that going to help me win my war? What you've said is introspective. I get that, but I'm looking beyond my borders to win
Right.
my war. How does this holy war help me win that bigger war? Or does it?
It allows justifying to your own population absorbing other states that you view as part of
Yeah.
yourself.
Okay, got it.
I would say that is a big advantage as to, again, how the Russian world and that whole idea can be weaponized, because again, you can say that Russians are under attack anywhere that there are Russians and that their values are being somehow disrespected anywhere that a Russian population exists, which at this point is just about everywhere, but specifically in Eastern Europe. So I would say it is a continuation of almost the like Soviet defensive posture of needing a buffer zone from everything that is not them. I think that is the direction which we're heading.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, guys, any other questions?
Not a question, but just a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Russians really talk about the holy patriotic war, that they won the war. They do not give a single sentence or word to the enormous help that Britain and the United States gave them. The United States gave them several thousands of airplanes. So did the Brits, not as many. They gave them hundreds of tanks every month for 3 years, from 1941 to 44. None of that is ever acknowledged by the Russians. The
Absolutely.
Great Patriotic Holy War was not totally won by the Russians. It's a lot of propaganda.
Yeah.
And that propaganda is used to imbue their people with whatever spirit, religion that they need to keep on moving forward.
Yeah, and I in no way wanted to undervalue the fact that it was an Allied victory in my presentation. The only thing that I would say is that, again, the Soviet Union paid the blood price for the victory in World War II, just because of the amount of dead that we had and the fact that the war was fought a lot of the time on our territory. But I'm in no way saying that it was primarily a war won by the Soviet Union. It was definitely 100% a joint effort, and it could not have been achieved without the effort of everyone combined.
Thank you.
Just to clarify my own statement.
All right, good stuff. Vas, I'm going to give the floor back to you for any closing words or closing remarks.
I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in today. I hope you find this topic as interesting as I do. I hope I did it justice, and I hope you all have a great rest of your night.
Okay, and with that, Vas, thank you very much. On behalf of RAUSI, thanks for taking the time to put this presentation together. It's a hugely important subject, and I think you've done it justice. People in the West truly don't understand what's happening in Russia, and they don't understand what has happened and is happening now in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. So I'm glad that you put this together. So I thank you very much for your presentation, and I would like to say good night to everybody. Vas, once again, my heartfelt thanks to you. Excellent presentation. Thank you for taking the time. And for those of you who attended and participated, thanks for those questions. I hope this was worthwhile. We will see you in September.